Welcome to another episode of A Fist for the Lenses. In this episode we'll be asking why use digital SLRs and vintage lenses in 2026. Is it just a matter of cost, or are there less obvious benefits to going vintage? Also, what about vintage zooms? Should we be dismissing them out of hand, or are they a low-cost alternative that opens up a lot of creative possibilities? And speaking of cost, how cheap can you go and still get great results? Well, let's find out. So in this episode, we'll be using two digital SLRs and two mirrorless cameras, along with a range of lenses, both zooms and primes. And as usual, both the video and stills will be shown straight out of camera, without any editing or colour grading, apart from a little cropping on a few images. The reason for this is to show a warts and all real-world application and a start point for you to work with a realistic assessment of the limitations and the creative possibilities of using vintage camera gear, like the Canon 5D Mark I, which was the first digital SLR I owned, and the camera that convinced me that digital was the way to go, and the camera I replaced it with, the Canon 5D Mark III. We'll be touching on their strengths and exposing some of their limitations, and briefly looking at what lens mounts that are adaptable to the Canon digital SLR range of cameras. I'll also be starting a new feature on the channel where I point you in the direction of YouTube channels I enjoy watching myself, but more on that later. So the lenses we'll be focusing on in this episode range in date from 2002 right the way back to 1973. So quite a big chunk of camera history in this one. Speaking of history, let's take a trip down memory lane and see what the world was like in 1973, which according to the Popular Mechanics magazine is when the Vivitar 70 to 210mm zoom was available to buy. 1973 not only saw the launch of the lens, but also America's first space station, Skylab. It was also the year when Roberta Flack made #1 with her song Killing Me Softly with his song. Also to make the news in 1973 was a report of a lorry filled with Vicks Vapor Rub overturning on the motorway. Amazingly, there was no congestion for 8 hours. Anyway, that was the world in 1973, when the oldest of our zoom lenses on review was first made available. But how usable are vintage zooms today? Well, let's start with a lens that's a little bit more modern. This one came to market in 1998. It's the Canon 100 to 400mm L series lens, and this is the first version of that lens. So let's start by pairing the lens with the Canon 5D Mark III. At the time of putting this video together, I spotted a 5D Mark III for sale for £275 with a 12-month warranty. And that's a lot of camera for such a relatively small outlay. And when you start comparing digital SLRs to more modern mirrorless cameras, costs has to be taken into account. The camera does a good but not great job at tracking moving subjects. There are more modern cameras that will give you a higher hit rate, but that shouldn't put you off, and with patience there's no reason you can't get some beautiful results. The camera shoots at a maximum of 6 frames per second, and although that seems pedestrian by today's standards, I can assure you it's fast enough to get some great action shots. The Canon 100 to 400mm L series lens exhibits a beautiful creamy dreamy bokeh. The optical formula of the lens is 17 elements in 14 groups. and it feels reassuringly well made, if a little heavy by modern standards. Autofocus is quick, especially when you consider that this lens was released in 1998. But it's that 400mm reach that I took advantage of the most when testing this lens. With shy wildlife like these fallow deer, you can't get too close for obvious reasons. That's where a lens like this comes into its own. .400mm is usually just enough reach to keep a respectable distance, like with these grey seals and pups at Horsey Gap on the east coast of Norfolk. Now let's switch cameras and adapt the lens to the Sony A7R Mark III, and let's see how it copes with shooting some video. The lens is plenty sharp enough even when shot wide open, and has a beautiful quality to the bokeh. Although one mistake I made when using the lens was keeping the image stabilizer on, and ruining the sound on much of the video I shot, which is something I need to watch out for next time. Now let's switch gear and use a zoom lens with a Canon 5D Mark III that's on the other end of the focal length scale. This time it's the Canon 17-40mm L series lens circa 2002. Naturally, this focal length lends itself to landscape shots, so let's focus on that for this one. One benefit of a zoom lens is that it lets you experiment with focal lengths, which helped me to figure out my preferred angle of view. After checking my personal favourite shots, I noticed that the majority were shot at 21mm, which helped me narrow down my search for a dedicated wide-angle prime for landscapes, eventually settling on the Carl's Zeiss Distagon 21mm f2.8 that I've reviewed on the channel in the past. But let's focus on zooms for a few minutes, and specifically looking at some of the advantages that they give you. So sticking with this lens, let's switch cameras to the Canon 5D Mark I, circa 2005. Specifically looking at zoom lenses, another real-world benefit is that sometimes you need to subtly change your angle of view to crop out in camera some distracting part of the scene, or just to make an image work, which leaves you less time editing on the computer afterwards. And also, this allows you to use the full sensor area, which helped me squeeze out every bit of quality from the 12.8 megapixel sensor of the Canon 5D Mark I. I've heard it said many times that you can just zoom with your feet, and that is true most of the time, but not always, as I wouldn't advise you doing that when perched on some rock that's jutting out into the sea. Sometimes there's just no substitute for a good quality zoom. Canon digital SLRs are often overlooked when people talk about adapting vintage optics, but the EF mount opens up a lot of possibilities. You can easily adapt Contax Yashica, Olympus OM, Nikon F, Leica R and M42 lenses, amongst others, opening up thousands of lenses to experiment with. And it's how I first dipped my toe into adapting vintage glass. But let's switch cameras again, this time to the Fuji X-T1, and let's explore how cheap you can go and still get good results. The lens used here is the Vivitar 28mm f2.8 close focus from 1978. It cost me the princely sum of £10. When paired to the XT1's crop sensor, it gives you the equivalent angle of view of a 42mm. But now let's adapt the lens to the Sony a7R Mark III and use it as it was intended, as a wide angle. It's a surprisingly sharp lens when shot wide open, but with flare when shooting into the light. So £10 is quite affordable, but let's see if we can go one better. Let's adapt to the Sony a lens from Yashica that cost me just 99p. This would take some beating. Even with the postage paid, this cost me less than the price of a decent coffee. That's the beauty of getting into vintage optics. It can let you experiment without breaking the bank. And it's hard to get disappointed with something that cost you so little. Also, there are still lenses out there to discover that are cheap. Not because they are bad, it's just they haven't been made popular. The Helios 44-2 that has become popular and sells for much more than this one was once seen as a bit of a dog. It isn't as sharp as the Yashica, and the Yashica beats it hands down in build quality. The last lens we look at is the Vivitar Series 1 70-210mm from 1973. This lens garnered rave reviews as it was an affordable zoom that had a relatively fast constant aperture of f3.5 and set a new standard in optical quality for zooms of the period. It's a very well made lens, and although I feel it's well worth the £15 I paid for it, we need to be realistic. It's a lens that's over 50 years old, and it can't compete with a good modern zoom for sharpness. Contrast is also lower than a modern lens, and it will flare more easily. There are times when this can help you creatively to evoke a mood, but other times it's less welcome. Manual focus lens can also be frustrating when trying to shoot a moving subject. So to conclude, am I dismissing vintage zooms? Not at all, but just keep in mind that the older the zoom, the more optically challenged they tend to be. And for me, this is as old as I'd want to go. At this point of the video, I'd like to point you in the direction of a YouTube channel I've enjoyed watching for some time. The channel's name is During the Meanwhiles, where photographer and all-round nice guy Nick lets us join him on his photographic journeys. I particularly enjoy his nature walks, but really there's something for everyone, as Nick is an accomplished landscape and macro photographer. This episode's shout out goes to During the Meanwhilest. So for me, that's all for this episode, except to thank you all for your continued support. I feel the channel is becoming a community where we can benefit from each other's experience, and I really appreciate your comments and your interactions. But it's time I got back out there, in the real world. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe and ring that bell. And then who knows, maybe we'll see each other out there in the real world, snapping away happily with a fistful of lenses. Until next time, bye for now.